Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler, and I'm presenting here a series of steps by which one can sort of plausibly get from the idea that it is inevitable that essentially what's happened on this planet would happen, including the serious challenges that we face as the civilization creating creature. Uh, I don't know how inevitable some of those early steps should be considered as being. That it's inevitable that life has emerged in many places in the cosmos. That it's inevitable that there would be one area of the living system on that whatever planet it is. There would be one path that had to do with the development of intelligence as a means of adaptation to various levels, but that it would be inevitable that out of that, over enough time, there would emerge more and more intelligence because, indeed, the equipment for intelligence is not going to be there quickly. It needs to be built over time. Something like the human brain, there's no way it was going to emerge a billion years ago, and we're only one-celled creatures. But over time, we got the reptilian and the mammalian, and then the neocortex, the human, being built through the evolutionary process. I think that maybe it's inevitable that eventually you would get to the point where the intelligence that inevitably emerged as a strategy for survival would reach the point where you've got somebody's got enough of a mind that they are, for the first time in the history of life, 3.5 billion years, they got the capacity to invent different ways of life than they evolved to have. They can change the rules. Chimpanzees don't. I think that is why wouldn't it happen? I've imagined over the past generations that if we destroy ourselves, but life sort of makes a comeback like it did after the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, that 20 million years from now, there would be maybe some other species, maybe from some totally different line, probably mammalian, that would have evolved into creatures like we did, able to create culture and then to make the breakthrough into civilization. Now, I'm not clear on how inevitable it is that if a creature took the path of culture, eventually they would have to, that it's eventually going to be the case that they break out of their niche and start to create civilization. I'm not clear about that. In that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, I utilized some apparently good anthropology to make an argument, but it's just an argument. It's a decent argument, but at least it was decent when I articulated it back in the late 70s and early 80s, that the spread of humankind in the tens of thousands of years, let's say from 50,000 years on, or maybe a bit more, I don't know. But we as hunter-gatherers, we had essentially become global. Every part of the world, I believe, had human groups. There was a lot of success involved in that. And because we were cultural creatures, we were able to continue to innovate ways in which we could survive better. And that probably meant that human population, for the first time, you've got a creature with a lot of cultural creativity capacity, pardon me, and who also therefore will be facing limitations like creatures always do. I mean, where the population of every given creature is sort of regulated by a fair amount of death. But you get to the point where, well, instead of dying, um, we could find more efficient use ways of surviving off of what we already have. And my guess is, and my guess was in that book, based on some anthropology and such, that there was a necessity that drove people to start to create a new way of life through horticulture, herding, and then on into agriculture. So maybe it's inevitable that a cultural creature will eventually succeed so well on the basis of its superior intelligence, playing by the usual rules, like staying in their niche, that when they come up against, well, either our children die or we can figure out something else, and we start utilizing things more efficiently and getting more control over whether, you get a forest and destroy the forest and you use it instead to feed human beings. And we start to take control of the natural world in a way that we hadn't before, and that reasonably could be seen as moving down that trail as being something required eventually, that there is going to be saturation with the old rules, need to develop, or, and the tension between the tendency of populations to grow and the finitude of the land meant that these hunting-gathering peoples who are maybe innovating gardens and all that kind of stuff are getting the capacity that the pure hunting-gathering peoples didn't have to expand, to grow as entities, to control more territory. All kinds of things become possible that weren't possible for hunter-gatherers. And so that means that they're going to be within reach of each other. Have to deal with each other. And the thing is, these entities that are not about a pre-existing natural order, they've escaped from that by inventing their own way of life. These entities are going to have to interact in a way, under circumstances that are not ordered by either some ecological systemic thing like the rest of life, or by any kind of human thing, because one could go into why that would be completely impossible at the outset. So what you end up with inevitably is these entities interacting without any order. And at this point, the concept of anarchy becomes really important. Life as an order, as it tends to be, as it gets shaped by the biological process, is not anarchic. Each organism follows its own law, but that law was itself shaped, it was crafted by a process that rewarded only what is able to get its DNA into the future over very long periods of time. So in the state of disorder, where you've got cultural entities, civilizing societies, that have an enormous range of possibilities beyond what other primate groups have, these civilized societies that are so increasingly drenched in culture can create a whole range of things that much more various, I would think, than any of the other animal societies, including our primate cousins. But all the rest of them, I don't think you're going to find the kind of variety that you can get out of a cultural creature. So we got all these possibilities or apparent possibilities. I'm going to show that they're not possible, that the system is going to dictate which direction it goes. But it appears to be a new birth, a birth of freedom, that people can have this kind of a culture or that kind of culture, this belief system or that belief system, all this kind of art form or that kind of art form, or this language or that language. Wow, you can go in so many different directions, and anthropology is full of illustrations of all the ways that our human societies might express our humanity. But in an anarchic situation, there's a dynamic that's systemic. And I like to use Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, which was anarchic and which then was ruled by warlords, and the Somalia of the early 1990s, which was anarchic and was, what you end up with are these gangs, machine guns on jeeps or whatever. We've seen history demonstrate before our eyes that if you've got no order controlling how things are going to be transacted in the interactions among these entities, then you're going to end up with the spirit of the gangster wielding much more say about how the world is going to be. But I use Lebanon and Somalia because we've seen what happened. The same thing happened when civilization first emerged into that disorder that we call anarchy. There is inevitably a war of all against all. That's the phrase of Thomas Hobbes, who was 17th century English philosopher who basically, though he had a lousy sense of, the human prehistory, he understood what anarchy entailed. He's a guy who kind of observed it in the England of his time, and because it means a war of all against all. And I think he was on some losing side. He wrote his analysis of anarchy from the shores, I think, of the Netherlands or something like that. Anarchy leads to the rule of the gangster. It's a dangerous place. And you can also see it in medieval Europe when order broke down after the fall of the Roman Empire. There was this era in a lot of places. I don't really have a broad knowledge of all the things that maybe historians know, but in a broad sense, it's clear that it was an era of marauding bands, which made the world very dangerous, and which led to forms of domination they call the feudal order. But you can see the same thing as soon as civilization emerged in its full-blown nature. In all the places where it emerged independently, always took, in some meaningful way, the form of a tyrannical few exploiting a semi-enslaved or fully enslaved many, and a chronic waging of war of people who were calling the shots, people who evidently were obsessed with getting power, which is exactly what you would expect would survive in a war of all against all. So the dynamics of the system into which humankind plunged, when we broke out of the natural order into disorder, which is a form of anarchy, where nothing prevents actors from doing bad things, you end up with the things that can prevail in a war of all against all are the only ones that can survive and spread. The other ones get eliminated. That's a hugely consequential thing to recognize. It tells us that the spirit of the gangster has been given a disproportionate role in shaping the face of human civilization, which is why I always say the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. Not that I know a whole lot about the Somali people, but I'm not completely ignorant. The face of Somalia during that era where the gangsters, like three forms of, gangs that were fighting for control in Somalia after the collapse of the Somali government. I don't think that that's representative of what Somalis are like as a group of human beings. That's the disproportionate thing. That's why it's important to recognize that when the systemic dynamic mandates that only those that can prevail in this anarchic struggle for power that's inevitable are going to be able to survive and spread, and they can eliminate everything else, which leads me to what I call the parable of the tribes, which is a way of capturing the inevitable. This is the one thing that, as far as I can tell, it really is inevitable that the ways of power will spread through the system. And the parable is not really a parable. I mean, I'm more like a social scientist, but to me, that when I saw this thing, it hit me at such a deep spiritual level that I felt I needed to use words like parable and tribes to somehow capture. We're talking here about the essential key to understanding what's happened to us as a species, which I believe it is. And the parable runs like, the so-called parable runs like this. Imagine a group of tribes all living within reach of each other. If all choose to live in peace, to accept that they have only what they are entitled to and not take from anybody else, then all may live in peace. But what if all but one of those, let's say we started out with 20 societies, 19 of which are peace-loving, justice-loving, and we got this one piece that's ambitious for power or wealth or the combination. They are not content to have only what they have. That, by the way, can be shown to be a form of brokenness, but leave that aside for now. Let's talk about the inevitable force of brokenness that emerges when you have any power maximizing actor, even in a large system with many that are more benign. And it goes like this. Imagine that this one that's inflamed with this lust for power attacks one of its neighbors to absorb that territory because they want more. Like Johnny Rocco and Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Edward G. Robinson, Key Largo. What do you want, Johnny? Well, I want more. The gangster wants more. And that's, that's what we see wherever we see fascism working. Putin controlled Russia, but he wanted more. Donald Trump was the most powerful man in the world, but he wasn't willing to accept any limits. He wanted more. So that can happen, and it happens in people who are pretty broken. But in any event, the point here is the parable of the tribe shows that power functions as a contaminant, so that over time, only the ways of power are allowed to move forward. So, second option, the first one was getting conquered and annihilate those who are vanquished. And there's been plenty of that in history. The other one is conquering again, but instead of annihilating the other people and eliminating their culture entirely, in this case, they enslave them or exploit them in some way, use their superior power to benefit themselves at the expense of the well-being of those they have conquered. And as for the other society's culture, there's generally an effort to change it in whatever ways the conqueror finds in his interest. And culture tends to persist, but you can find plenty of ways in which The English, when they controlled India for however long that was, over 2 centuries, I think, East India Trading Company to, the successful Indian independence movement after 1946. There are plenty of ways in which English culture is present in India. But there are a lot of other cultures that were less powerful that pretty much get eliminated and get absorbed into the conqueror's way of thinking. I mean, just now I was thinking about the conquerors of the Europeans conquering this continent and driving Native Americans onto reservations ultimately through a lot of exercise of just raw power, breaking treaties and stuff like that. Part of the ugly pattern of history I was referring to. There's plenty of ugliness in human history, but it is inevitable that the people and organizations and societies that are able to grab power when the system is disordered, they get to call a lot of the shots. Their ways of power spread twice now, extermination and absorption, both following conquest. And then the third option, if you ask, looking at things from the point of view of the tribes, all the peace-loving tribes, what are their options? That's the question that I'm addressing here to demonstrate some inevitability here. That there are only four options: getting exterminated, getting conquered and exploited, and then the third one is we can see what's happening to our neighbors. Let's get the hell out of here. Which I kind of like that one, but over time these gangster powers extend their reach. It becomes harder and harder to escape them. You can't just go off into the mountains. You maybe got to go all the way to the Arctic, or you got to go all the way into the Amazon jungle or something like that, something inaccessible. But anyway, the less able the empires are to rule, that's a place to go. But one has abandoned one's place in the the circumscribed area that we started out with. Imagine a group of tribes all living within reach of each other on the Nile Valley, the Mesopotamia, or the Indus, or the Yellow River, all those places where societies arose in clusters and were within reach of each other. And here we have this dynamic in which power is spreading like a contaminant. That's the key phrase. Here's how power spreads as a contaminant. The first three ways at the end of that interaction, the one imperial, lustful, power-seeking thing we started out with now controls more and more territory. His ways have been spread, and I say his because war of all against all generates societies which tend to be, that's where the patriarchy comes from, by the way. I have an old memory about me and Marianne Eisler talking about these things in front of an audience of the Institute for Noetic Sciences back in the mid-1980s. She saw the patriarchy as the problem. I say the war of all against all and the force that it generates is the problem. The patriarchy results from that. I digress. The fourth way, and I say there are only four ways, is for a society to defend itself. And every society, in order to protect itself, if it is indeed under the gun from a powerful neighbor, it's only going to be able to defend itself if it's got that same kind of power which allows a society to prevail in a war of all against all. They need the power it takes to survive against a powerful threat. Otherwise, they're going to get beaten just like the others. But that means they can't entirely just continue with the culture they had unless the culture they had already conferred on them that kind of power. But if we are postulating that they had a rather different spirit about them, in order to resist a power that's, the raw power of you know, that it takes to conquer, for one society to conquer another. Well, however you want to think about what that takes, some of it's economic and technological, and some of it's political, and some of it, a lot of it's got to do with the ability to put a military force on the ground that overpowers the other side, a war of all against all. If you ever travel to Europe, and I haven't spent much time there, but I'm always struck by how, in a major era of European history, all the societies built their cities up on the top of a hill or a mountainish even. There's a town named, I think it's Orvieto, about an hour's drive from Rome. And it's way up on a butte of some kind. I don't remember the topography exactly, but if you're driving there, as I was, you're driving up a bunch, and you can see that they've taken the high ground to defend themselves from the world around them. The war of all against all was definitely there. And you can get an idea of how that warps the evolution of a society just by considering how much extra work it was to build a city there. You got to be super motivated to carry those huge, weighty rocks up there to build a city. Wow. The last place you'd want to build, unless it was a matter of life and death, which it was, which it must have been. And all over you see that the feudal castles are the high ground. Much easier to defend in an anarchic world. That's indicative of how warping the war of all against all must be. 4 options. The last one to complete, it's basically imitation. Not necessarily saying you have to become exactly like your enemy, but you got to match them with enough power. And if they've tapped into some new form of power, you got to do that too. I mean, if they got, essentially, you don't have the central control where you can have one chess player moving the pieces on the board. Well, you don't want chaos. You're not going to do very well if you can't coordinate. So you get more central control. Maybe it's an economic thing. I mean, for example, in World War II, American productivity, GDP, or GNP as it was called back then, it was a GDP war, some people say. Ultimately, we outproduced the Nazi regime. They may have been pound for pound a better military force. I've read that that's the case. I don't like that idea. I love World War II movies where Americans are always but they always had respect for the German adversary, that's for sure. And maybe, I don't know. But in any event, the United States had this industrial might that translated into military power. When European gunboats started colonizing all the archaic societies on this planet, the Japanese saw what was happening to China, and they saw that it was either industrialized, become more like the powers that threatened them, or get gobbled up like they saw the rest of Asia being gobbled up. And so they industrialized, and they became a significant military power, enough to be a significant challenge to the United States during World War II. Enough even years before that to defeat a European army, to the shock of all the European racists. And they beat the Russians in 1905. But anyway, that's the imitation means that even though this outcome, we're going to defend ourselves, is different in terms of we're not the victims exactly of being under the thumb of that conqueror. Nonetheless, from the outside point of view of how is this system evolving, It means that inexorably the ways of power will spread throughout the whole system. That's the nature of anarchy, is that there is a selective process where the power to shape the world goes to the spirit of the gangster. And that's inevitable. I say, and I present this argument systematically on my website, abetterhumanstory.org. I say that this proves, really, that it is an inevitable function, consequence of the emergence of a creature on the path of civilization. Once you get to there, and I don't know if every step that gets you there that I've said was maybe inevitable. I don't know how inevitable. But once you get there, there is no escape. You know, people have sometimes said to me, well, what about the Gandhi's solution, nonviolence? And I've encountered that a lot, because people of a liberal persuasion, such as me and my kindred spirits, a lot of them don't want to recognize that there is this kind of necessity, that you don't necessarily have the choice of avoiding the conflict, of disregarding the requirements of power in an anarchic situation, and getting to do only what you believe in, you're realizing your ideal. And you don't necessarily have the option that you're going to, make it into the future. Now, when people bring up the Gandhi idea, my response is, I think Gandhi's tools are hugely important, and Martin Luther King proved that by using them here in the United States. But both United States and Great Britain are on the more humane side of by the spirit of the gangster spectrum. If somebody had tried Gandhi's approach in the Stalinist regime or in Hitler's regime, I don't think that they would have slowed down the bulldozer of power. Gandhi was a master of public relations. He made the newspapers in London. He created a political groundswell in a fairly enlightened democratic country. But not every regime is so ruled by power, or not every situation. Most situations, I would say, throughout history, what Gandhi attempted to do would probably just get snuffed out in some fashion, whether it's the Gulag or ditch it, Baba Yar, or however they would deal with it. But when there is anarchy, the power that emerges tends to be pretty destructive. Democracy is a major counteractant to this inevitable tendency for the spirit of the gangster to get too much of a say. And so our American battle right now in this presidential election, and in other ways I expect in the years to come, is a battle between whether we're going to be ruled by a spirit of the gangster, and Trump is always compared to a mob boss one way and another. I mean, he is a gangster, like Putin's a gangster. And I would say Hamas are gangsters in some fundamental way. And the ruling group in Israel right now, so tragically, is governed by the spirit of the gangster. It's important to recognize that civilization, if you step across, break out of the natural order, you're going to be up against this war of all against all. This war of all against all is going to generate a selective process whereby only the ways of power can survive and spread. And that the only way you can get something more humane, which I think we by nature would choose and would be able to put in effect, is to be able to control the destructive force that we inevitably unleashed as soon as we broke out of the bounds of an ordered system and into an anarchic system. In the next one of this series, I'm going to talk about the inevitability that if a creature embarks on the path of civilization, there will be an inevitable challenge. There will inevitably be a danger that species will not be able to control its civilization in time to avoid self-destruction. So that I would say that at the core of the story of humankind and of any other creature out there on some other planet or wherever that embarks on the path of civilization, the question's going to arise. Will this species be able to control the destructive force that it inevitably unleashed when it became civilization creating in time so that it can have a well-ordered civilization in whatever ways are required so that it becomes either impossible or at least minimally possible that it will destroy itself so that it can exist on the planet for the long haul without like a nuclear holocaust and without bringing the whole ecosystem down on its head, both of which are dangers that we can see right now on our horizon. That is what I will talk about in a future entry into this. But the other thing that we could see is that our challenge in America right now about whether we'll remain a democracy or whether we'll become a fascist regime is like a central part of a very long story of all the showdowns there have been in the history of human civilization about just how broken our world is going to be. It took a long time to get where you could have, say you had a big, important civilization in which the will of the people actually did have a big say. And like Franklin said, if we can keep it. So that's our challenge for the moment. And it's part of a much bigger challenge, which involves whether we'll survive on this planet as a civilization creating species. And that dilemma, that challenge, is an inevitable consequence of any step onto the path of civilization, which may mean that it's inevitable that if life begins on a planet, eventually it'll get to the point where the creature might destroy itself. And that's the next thing about why I think it is in fact inevitable that if there is a cultural animal, it will eventually have the power to destroy itself if it doesn't control the destructive forces. I'll be back with that. Thanks. Oh, and if you want to see any of this stuff presented more systematically than I do in this improv zone, I confer upon myself as a place to talk from, please go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org. I'm an amateur at this medium, but I was a pro at that medium. So please go there. And if you would subscribe and all that stuff, I would welcome that. Thank you. Bye-bye.